There are relationships that arrive in our lives like warm sunlight, and there are others that enter quietly, like a shadow that slowly forgets how to leave. And sometimes, without even noticing, we begin to shrink inside them. Our laughter becomes softer, our truth becomes smaller, and our spirit learns to sit down when it was born to stand. Tonight, we are not talking about blame, nor bitterness, nor regret. We are talking about awakening. Because there comes a moment when you must ask yourself, with honesty and courage, whether the love you are holding is still nurturing you, or whether it is quietly unmaking you, piece by piece, in the name of connection. And there is a kind of relationship that does not break you loudly. It does not arrive with shouting or storms that can be easily named. It begins instead with small adjustments, gentle suggestions, quiet corrections wrapped in the language of care. You are told at first that you are too much, too sensitive, too loud, too emotional, too intense. And because love often teaches us to compromise, you begin to believe that shrinking might be another word for loving better. So you soften your voice when you speak your truth. You pause before your opinions. You measure your words the way a cautious traveler measures each step across uncertain ground. Over time, what once was your natural expression begins to feel like something you must negotiate. You learn which version of yourself causes the least resistance, and you start offering that version more often than the real one. There is no single moment where everything changes. It is a quiet erosion, like water reshaping stone without ever raising its voice. And in that quiet erosion, your voice does not disappear all at once. It fades in stages. First from conversations, then from decisions, then from the inner permission you give yourself to even want what you want. And the most dangerous part is not that someone takes your voice away, but that you begin to place it aside willingly, believing peace requires your silence. You begin to confuse being agreeable with being loved. You begin to believe that harmony means the absence of your needs rather than the balance of them. So you laugh when you want to question, you nod when you want to refuse. You say, "It's fine," so many times that even your own heart starts to forget what is not fine. But a voice does not vanish without consequence. It retreats into the body. It becomes heaviness in the chest, hesitation in the throat, a strange fatigue in moments where truth should have been spoken but was not. And still you persist, because there is a hope that if you are gentle enough, quiet enough, small enough, the relationship will finally become safe enough for you to return to yourself inside it. Yet what is not made safe for your truth slowly becomes a place where your truth cannot survive. There comes a moment, subtle, almost unremarkable on the outside, when you realize you are present in name but absent in expression. You are there but not heard. You are speaking but not sounding like yourself anymore. And in that realization is a strange ache, because you remember who you were before you learned to dilute your voice for the comfort of someone else's world. And so the question begins to rise, not as accusation, but as awakening. How long can a person remain whole in a place where their voice is treated like something to be reduced rather than received? And then there is another kind of relationship, one that does not ask you to leave immediately, because it is more patient than that. It asks you to stay loyal while slowly forgetting what dignity feels like. It teaches you, in subtle ways, that love must be proven through endurance, and that suffering quietly is a form of devotion. At first, you call it commitment. You call it understanding. You call it giving someone grace. But over time, you begin to notice that what you are calling love has begun to feel like erosion of self-respect dressed in familiar language. You find yourself explaining the same things over and over again, as if your clarity is never quite enough to be believed. You begin to shrink your expectations, not because your heart has changed, but because you are tired of being made to feel as though your needs are excessive. And so you start negotiating with your own boundaries. You lower them not once, but repeatedly, until you can no longer recognize where they once stood. What remains is not peace, but exhaustion wearing the appearance of patience. This kind of relationship has a way of making loyalty feel like a test you must constantly pass. You stay, and staying is praised. You forgive, and forgiving is expected. You endure, and endurance becomes your identity. But in all of this giving, something essential begins to fade. The quiet inner knowing that you are meant to be treated with respect, even in moments of disagreement, even in moments of imperfection, even in moments of distance. Instead, you are taught that dignity is flexible, something you can temporarily set aside in order to keep the connection alive. And slowly, without dramatic rupture, you begin to forget the shape of your own worth. You stop asking why certain words cut deeper than they should. You stop noticing how often you are the one adapting, the one adjusting, the one bending. The relationship continues, but it becomes uneven in ways that are difficult to name and even harder to admit, because loyalty, when it is misused, can become a cage that looks like devotion from the inside. There is a moment that arrives quietly, often when you are alone, where you realize that being faithful to someone else has come at the cost of being faithful to yourself. And in that moment, something inside you stirs, not with anger first, but with recognition. A recognition that love was never meant to require the surrender of your dignity. That care does not ask you to disappear in order to be kept. And so the question rises, not as rebellion, but as clarity. What is loyalty worth if, in its name, you are repeatedly asked to forget your own value? There is also the kind of connection that does not survive your truth, only your silence. It welcomes you most warmly when you are agreeable, when you are easy, when you are carefully edited. In the beginning, you may not notice it because silence can sometimes look like peace. It can resemble harmony. It can even feel like maturity. But slowly, you begin to realize that this silence is not chosen freely. It is expected, and expectation, when unspoken but constant, becomes its own kind of pressure. You learn to read the room before you speak, not out of wisdom, but out of caution. You measure your thoughts for their impact before you ever give them breath. And when you do speak your truth, even gently, you notice the shift. A pause that lingers too long, a tone that cools, a presence that withdraws slightly, as if your honesty has disturbed something that was only comfortable when it was unquestioned. So you begin to adjust again, not because you lack truth, but because truth seems to cost you too much in that space. Over time, silence starts to feel like safety. You tell yourself that keeping the peace is more important than being fully seen. You convince yourself that not everything needs to be said, and in some ways that is true. But in this place, it is not discernment that guides you. It is fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being dismissed, fear of being met with discomfort that turns into distance. And so your truth becomes something you carry internally, but rarely release. What makes this kind of connection quietly harmful is not that it demands silence once or twice, but that it begins to reward it. You are praised when you are calm, when you are easy, when you do not complicate things with your honesty. And slowly, without anyone explicitly telling you to stop speaking, you begin to understand that your full expression is not entirely welcome. So you begin to offer less of it, not all at once, but piece by piece, until what remains is a version of you that feels safer for others, but less alive within yourself. And there comes a moment when you realize that you are deeply present in the relationship, yet only partially expressed. You are there physically, emotionally invested, but your truest thoughts have become visitors that never stay long enough to be known. In that realization, something unsettling happens. You begin to miss yourself, not the version others see, but the one who spoke without rehearsing, who trusted her own voice without apology. Because a connection that cannot hold your truth is not a place where your wholeness is truly received. It is a place where your silence is mistaken for compatibility, and your absence of resistance is mistaken for peace. And yet, beneath that understanding, a deeper question begins to rise quietly. What kind of love requires you to disappear in order to belong? And then there is the relationship that does not ask for your soul all at once, but only for its usefulness. It does not reject you in obvious ways. Instead, it welcomes you in proportion to what you can offer. Your presence is appreciated when it solves something, when it supports something, when it makes life easier, lighter, more convenient for the other person. And at first, you may not question this arrangement because usefulness can feel like being needed, and being needed can easily be mistaken for being loved. So you begin to show up in ways that ensure you remain valuable. You give advice when asked, and sometimes when not asked. You offer comfort even when your own heart is unsettled. You become the steady hand, the reliable voice, the one who understands, the one who adapts. And every time you are received with warmth in those moments, you quietly learn the rules of that connection. Stay useful, and you will be kept close. Become uncertain, and you may feel the distance begin. What is most subtle about this kind of bond is how it trains you to equate worth with function. You begin to believe that your presence alone is not enough to sustain connection. You must perform something of value, solve a problem, ease a burden, offer emotional labor that goes unspoken and often unreturned. And in doing so, you slowly begin to separate yourself from your own being. You are no longer just a person existing in relationship. You are a role being fulfilled within it. There are moments when you are tired, when you have nothing left to give, when your own inner world is asking for attention. But even then, you learn to reach outward before inward, because inward does not seem to hold as much currency in that space. And when you cannot provide what is expected, you may feel a subtle shift, not necessarily rejection spoken aloud, but a cooling of interest, a thinning of attention, a distance that feels like it arrived without announcement. And so you begin to question yourself in quiet ways. Am I still valued if I am not useful right now? Am I still wanted if I have nothing to solve, nothing to offer, nothing to carry for someone else? These questions do not always rise loudly in the mind, but they settle into the heart, shaping how you show up, shaping how you fear stillness, shaping how you measure your own presence in the lives of others. Over time, this creates a painful clarity. You begin to notice that certain connections thrive when you are giving, but become uncertain when you are simply being. And in that noticing, a deeper realization starts to form that a relationship rooted only in usefulness cannot hold the fullness of a human life, because a person is not a function, a person is not a service, a person is not meant to be valuable only in moments of output. And so the quiet question begins to rise within you, steady and unavoidable. If I am only cherished when I am useful, then who is cherishing me when I am simply here? And then there is the relationship that does something more subtle than harm. It converts your love into labor. It does not always look like exploitation in the beginning, because love itself is willing, love gives, love shows up, love tries. But in this space, your giving is quietly redirected, until it is no longer an offering from the heart, but an expectation placed upon your shoulders. You do not notice the shift at first, because love is patient, and patience can sometimes be mistaken for permission. You begin to find yourself constantly doing, constantly adjusting, constantly managing the emotional atmosphere around you. You anticipate needs before they are spoken. You fix what is unspoken. You hold what was never handed to you with care. And in return, what you begin to receive is not care in its truest sense, but maintenance of the relationship itself. As long as you keep giving, things feel stable. As long as you keep carrying, nothing falls apart. But stability built on one person's emotional labor is not balance. It is imbalance disguised as connection. There comes a point where you can no longer tell whether you are loved or merely depended upon, because care asks for presence, for mutual tending, for shared responsibility. But labor asks for output. It asks for endurance. It asks for you to keep going even when your inner world is asking for rest. And slowly you begin to confuse exhaustion with commitment. You begin to believe that the weight you are carrying is simply the weight of love itself. In this kind of relationship, your emotional effort becomes invisible currency. You spend it freely, hoping it will translate into warmth, into recognition, into reciprocity. But instead, it often becomes expected. What once felt like kindness begins to feel like obligation. What once felt like devotion begins to feel like duty. And when something becomes duty, it loses its softness. It loses its breath. It loses its ability to nourish you in return. And yet, you continue because stopping feels unfamiliar. You have built patterns around being the one who holds things together. You have learned to equate your effort with your worth inside the connection. So even when you are tired, even when something inside you grows quiet from overuse, you keep showing up. Not because you are always met with care, but because you have learned to fear what happens when you stop laboring for love that does not labor for you. There is a moment, often quiet and unremarkable from the outside, where you realize that your love has become a task list, not a shared experience. That you are not just feeling anymore, you are managing, maintaining, preventing collapse. And in that realization, something inside you pauses, not in bitterness, but in clarity, because love, in its truest form, does not ask to be carried alone. It does not thrive on imbalance. It does not survive only through your effort. And so the question rises, not as anger, but as truth, finally spoken inwardly. If love requires me to turn myself into labor to keep it alive, then is it still love, or has it become something I was never meant to sustain alone? And then there is the final kind of relationship, the one that does not always wound you in obvious ways, but instead unsettles something deeper, your sense of worth. It does not always shout or demand or withdraw in dramatic silence. Instead, it places you in a constant state of inner questioning, where you begin to wonder again and again whether you are enough, whether you are too much, whether you are ever truly right in simply being who you are. In this space, your existence stops feeling like something naturally celebrated and starts feeling like something that must be justified. You find yourself analyzing your words after you speak them, replaying your actions after they happen, searching for signs that you may have been acceptable in that moment. And slowly, without realizing it, your attention shifts away from living and moves toward evaluating yourself as if you are always under quiet review. There are moments when you feel a sense of closeness, but even those moments are often followed by doubt. You begin to question whether the warmth you received was earned or accidental, whether the affection you felt was stable or conditional. And in that uncertainty, you start adjusting yourself, not once, but continuously, hoping that if you become just a little more careful, a little more agreeable, a little less uncertain, you might finally reach a place where you do not have to question your place anymore. But the tragedy of this kind of bond is that it rarely offers that certainty. Instead, it keeps you suspended in a cycle of trying and wondering, giving and doubting, hoping and second-guessing. And in that cycle, your self-worth begins to lose its natural steadiness. It stops feeling like something rooted within you and starts feeling like something determined by the shifting responses of another person. You may not even notice how deeply this affects you at first. It shows up quietly, in the hesitation before speaking, in the need for reassurance that feels constant, in the way you begin to measure your value through reactions rather than through your own inner knowing. And over time, you begin to forget what it feels like to simply exist without evaluation, without comparison, without the subtle pressure of wondering whether you are measuring up in the eyes of someone else. And yet, beneath all of this, there remains a quieter truth trying to surface, a truth that has not disappeared, only been buried under layers of doubt. It is the truth that your worth was never meant to be something you negotiate in the presence of another person. It was never meant to rise and fall with approval, or shift with attention, or depend on being constantly reassured. And so, in the middle of all this questioning, a deeper realization begins to form, gentle but undeniable, that any connection which consistently makes you doubt your right to exist fully, without apology or performance, is not reflecting your inadequacy, but revealing its inability to see you clearly. And in that realization, the question slowly turns back toward something simpler, something more honest. What would it feel like to be in a place where your existence is not something you have to earn, but something that is already enough? And then there is the kind of relationship where love does not arrive as freedom, but as something that quietly tightens around your life, calling itself care, while slowly deciding what your life should look like. It does not always begin with restriction. At first, it feels like attention. It feels like concern. It feels like someone noticing you deeply, as if your safety matters more than anything else. And because being cared for is a beautiful thing, you may not immediately recognize when care begins to carry weight. Slowly, decisions start to shift away from you, not in obvious ways, but in subtle suggestions that sound like protection. You are told what is best for you, what is safe for you, what you should avoid, what you should not say, where you should not go, who you should not trust. And each suggestion is wrapped in the language of love, so refusing it feels like rejecting affection itself. So you begin to comply, not because you lack awareness, but because you do not want to wound something that claims to care for you so deeply. Over time, the space of your life begins to feel slightly narrower. Choices that once felt natural now require quiet permission. Your instincts, which once guided you freely, begin to second-guess themselves. And yet, from the outside, it may still look like love. It may still sound like devotion. But inside, something begins to feel different. You start noticing that care is no longer expanding your world. It is organizing it, shaping it, defining it in ways that leave less room for your own inner voice. There is a particular confusion that grows here because control rarely introduces itself as control. It arrives as protection. It says, I know better. It says, I am only trying to keep you safe. And safety is a word that carries tenderness, so you hesitate to question it. But love that requires your shrinking in order to feel secure is not protection in its truest sense. It is possession wearing soft language. And as this continues, you may begin to notice how often you explain yourself before acting, how often you anticipate disapproval before even expressing a desire. You may find that you are no longer simply choosing, but calculating. And in that calculation, something essential begins to fade. The ease of being yourself without surveillance, even emotional surveillance disguised as concern. What makes this kind of dynamic so difficult to name is that it often comes with affection. There may still be warmth, still be gestures of care, still be moments that feel loving, but love that is interwoven with control creates a quiet tension, where your safety and your freedom begin to feel like they cannot exist in the same breath. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to choose safety that feels tight over freedom that feels uncertain. But there is a moment, subtle yet steady, when something inside begins to question whether love should require permission to be yourself, whether being cared for should mean being guided away from your own instincts. And in that questioning, a truth begins to surface gently but clearly, that love which must control your steps to feel secure has not fully learned how to trust you. And then the deeper realization arrives, not as rebellion, but as awakening. That real protection does not replace your choices, it supports them. It does not narrow your world, it helps you stand more fully within it. And then there is the relationship that quietly asks you to call exhaustion by another name: loyalty. It does not always announce itself as harmful because it is wrapped in history, shared memories, and moments that once felt meaningful. And that is what makes it difficult to see clearly. You are not just holding on to a person, you are holding on to versions of yourself that once felt alive inside that connection. So even when something begins to drain you, you hesitate because letting go feels like abandoning more than a relationship. It feels like abandoning time, effort, and parts of your own story. You stay longer than your peace can afford, not always because you do not see the damage, but because you keep remembering the moments that were gentle, the moments that felt like home. And so you begin to negotiate with your own discomfort. You tell yourself that every relationship has difficult seasons, that endurance is part of love, that loyalty means staying even when it hurts. But there is a difference between weathering difficulty together and slowly disappearing inside something that no longer nourishes you. Over time, the spirit begins to speak in quieter ways. It shows up as fatigue that rest does not fully fix, as a heaviness that lingers even after conversations end, as a sense that something essential in you is being asked to constantly stretch without return. And still, you remain because loyalty has been taught as a virtue that should override everything else, even your own inner knowing. But there comes a point where loyalty starts to feel less like devotion and more like self-abandonment. You begin to notice that you are not growing inside the relationship, you are maintaining it. You are not expanding, you are accommodating. And slowly, without dramatic rupture, your inner world begins to feel more distant from the life you are living inside that bond. And then there is the other kind of realization, the one that arrives almost quietly, almost painfully simple, that something can still exist in your life and no longer belong to your peace. It does not always end loudly. Sometimes it ends in silence, in emotional distance, in the way your heart no longer rushes forward the way it once did. It ends in the realization that you are no longer fully present inside something you are still physically or emotionally holding on to. And this is where the hardest truth begins to surface, that staying is not always the same as preserving love. Sometimes staying becomes a way of delaying truth, a way of avoiding the moment where you admit that what once supported you is now slowly pulling you away from yourself. And yet, even in that realization, letting go is not easy, because what has already become familiar often feels safer than what is unknown. But there is a moment, subtle yet undeniable, when you realize that peace is not something you should have to leave yourself to maintain. That love, if it is still alive in its truest form, does not require your spirit to be consistently diminished in order to survive. And in that understanding, something begins to shift, not outwardly at first, but inwardly, where clarity begins to take the place of confusion. And so the question rises gently but firmly within you: if a bond has already taken your peace, what exactly are you still calling it loyalty to?